The Canadian game of hockey combines elements of both Indigenous and European sports and really started to take shape around the mid 1800s. And while its exact origin and evolution are debated, it's agreed that the first modern indoor game took place on March 3rd, 1875 in Montreal, which was Canada's largest city at the time. Here's an early postcard image of that event. The game ended early after fights broke out between players and spectators. In 1894, the first Stanley Cup, a trophy for Canada's top amateur team, was challenged for, and as this magazine article from the following year illustrates, by that time the sport was firmly established in parts of the United States as well. By 1910, hockey defined Canada's winter culture and was as visible in Toronto as anywhere else in the country, as you can see from the players amongst the skaters on Grenadier Pond, as well as from all the sticks in this schoolyard rink. And it wasn't just the boys who played. Hockey's widespread popularity in Canada and the American Northeast created a paying public willing to spend money to watch games. So, from the amateur ranks sprung pro leagues and teams, including in Canada's second largest city back then. The first such franchise there, appropriately called the Toronto Professional Hockey Club, was established in 1906. From 1912 to 17, the National Hockey Association included at various times Toronto clubs called the Tecumsehs, Shamrocks, Blue Shirts, and Ontarios, and a team of soldiers known as the 228th Battalion, which only played a dozen games. Here is a 1914 newspaper ad for a Blue Shirts game against the Ontarios. And here's one for a game against the Montreal Wanderers. In 1917, the National Hockey Association became the National Hockey League, and the Toronto Hockey Club, aka the Blue Shirts, survived the transformation. They were renamed the Arenas in 1918, won the NHL's first Stanley Cup, and then were rebranded as the Toronto St. Patricks the following year. When the St. Pats fell on hard financial times in 1927, they were going to be sold for $200,000 and moved to Philadelphia. That's when Conn Smythe, a Toronto businessman and hockey renaissance guy, stepped in and spearheaded the purchase of the club, along with other investors and friends like J.P. Bickle. Smythe had captained local university clubs during the 1920s and was an outstanding coach in the city, winning multiple varsity and OHA titles, including an Allen Cup. Those talents got him hired to build and run the first ever New York Rangers team in 1926. And as luck would have it, right after assembling that squad, he was abruptly fired as general manager and coach. His compensation was some cash and the rights to one player. Then Smythe got a call from Bickle, a part owner of the St. Pats, who told him that Toronto's NHL franchise was for sale. The league allowed Conn to purchase the club in part because of the poor way he had been treated by New York. In February 1927, after buying the team, he patriotically renamed them the Maple Leafs and gave them their leafy logo, while keeping the St. Pat's green and white motif. Like this. In the off-season, he changed to more traditional Toronto colors, and in November of 1927, the blue and white launched their first full NHL campaign. Here's an ad for a December 1927 game against the Detroit Cougars, who later became the Falcons and then the Red Wings. And an ad for a 1928 game against the New York Americans. That year, Toronto played in a 10-team NHL against the Americans, Rangers, Boston Bruins, Pittsburgh Pirates, Montreal Canadiens, Montreal Maroons, Ottawa Senators, and the Chicago Blackhawks, along with those Detroit Cougars. With Conn Smythe behind the bench as coach, that very first Leafs team featured three legendary names in club history: Primo, Day, and Bailey. Irvin Ace Bailey had been with the franchise since 1926 and was one of only 8 players that Smythe kept from that St. Patrick's team he bought. There's Bailey on the right in 1928, with 2 other players Smythe retained, Danny Cox on the left and Bill Carson at center. Clarence "Hap" Day joined the St. Pats in 1924 and was named the Maple Leafs' original captain in 27, a position he held for 10 years. While Hap would eventually wear this C on some legendary Leafs teams, Toronto's first 3 years were a slow crawl upwards from having been dead last in their division in 26-27. In 27-28, they finished fourth, but still out of the playoffs. Here's an ad for opening night of the Leafs' 1928-29 season. The game was held where the franchise had played since they were the Blue Shirts, at the Arena Gardens rink on Mutual Street, which held a maximum crowd of no more than 8,000. A few new names auditioned with the club that year, some successfully and some not so much. Alex Gray played in only 7 regular season and 4 playoff games, but was around long enough to get his picture taken and appear on a card. And George "Shorty" Horn, seen here in November 1928, finished his NHL career at the end of that season, having played a total of 58 games over 3 years. However, some of the new faces on the team were to make a lasting impression. Players like Andy Blair, Harold "Baldy" Cotton, and in particular, George "Red" Horner, who a decade later would be the Leafs captain. The 28-29 season saw team manager Smythe make a complete overhaul in net when he brought in goaltenders Benny Grant and Lorne Chabot. This meant the end of the line in Toronto for John Ross Roach after 7 years with the franchise, including a Stanley Cup with the St. Pats. At that time, the La Presse newspaper was publishing colored photos of sports celebrities. They printed hundreds of these images. 8 were Maple Leafs, including Roach. In early January 1929, the Leafs advertised for an upcoming game against the Ottawa Senators. Fans were encouraged to buy tickets to see the Leafs' Bill Carson, quote, and his bag of tricks, as well as Ottawa's King Clancy, who was described as, quote, combination Wildcat, Human Express, and good fellow. That season was a time of real growth for the Leafs, punctuated by Ace Bailey leading the NHL in goals and points, a third-place finish in their division, and the team's first appearance in the playoffs, where they beat the Cougars in the quarterfinals before losing to the Rangers in the semis. So delighted was Leafs ownership that they bought Conn Smythe a car in gratitude. In this 1929 newspaper piece, you can see team president Pete Campbell with the coach, who is seated in his fancy new sport roadster. Remember how Smythe's settlement with the Rangers included the rights to a single player? Conn retained a skater who would become one of the greatest Toronto Maple Leafs of all time when he signed a personal services contract with the immortal Joe Primo in 1926. The fact that Smythe owned the player before he owned the St. Patrick's makes Primo, by default, the very first Toronto Maple Leaf, even though Hap Day and other veterans were kept after the St. Patrick's purchase. Primo's career got off to an inauspicious start, to say the least. He was only used sporadically by the Leafs and with poor results, and had been repeatedly sent down to the minor leagues for development. So then, how did this now 23-year-old with only 8 NHL games experience end up in the Hall of Fame? In fact, Toronto's 1929-30 season began with Smythe almost selling Primo to a team in Buffalo, just as the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange launched the Great Depression. On top of all that turmoil, every player on the team, except Hap Day, had a terrible year, and the Leafs dropped back to 4th in the division, missing the playoffs. However, there was a silver lining, or two, in the form of Charlie Conacher and Harvey Busher Jackson. Both were Toronto-born teenage stars. Conacher came from a family famous for its athletes, and stories of his own prodigious skills made the newspapers. Jackson was an unsigned gem discovered by local junior hockey manager Frank Selke, a name you'll hear a few times throughout this series. Smythe had been honing Primo's considerable skills for years away from the NHL spotlight, and once he was able to secure talented wingers like Conacher and Jackson, Kahn knew the Maple Leafs had something special. The three players made their first appearance together on a line on December 7th, 1929. With Primo at center, the Kid Line, as the trio was called due to its particularly youthful wingers, spent the next 7 years terrorizing opposition goaltenders, totaling 863 points between them at a time when the season was roughly half the length of today's. By the end of 1929-30, Joe Primo's dominant playmaking skills were so evident that the New York Rangers actually went to the NHL and tried to reclaim him after 4 years. The league said no. Smythe knew that he was close to fulfilling his dream of building a championship club. But he also knew that two things were needed. One of them he could build, but the other he'd have to buy.